At 2 o'clock in the morning on June 17th, 1944, in a flattened sugarcane field on the western edge of the ruined town of Guadalcanal on the island of Saipan, two United States Marines lay flat in the dark. They were close enough to a Japanese sentry to hear him breathe. They were not lost. They were not cut off from their own lines by accident. They were exactly where they had chosen to be, roughly 2 miles behind the Japanese front, hunting the soldiers who were supposed to be the masters of this ground. The sentry never heard them move. He never called out. One of the 2 Marines rose behind him out of the cane, and the man went down without a shot, without a shout, without a single sound that carried past the next row of stalks. The 2 Marines took what they had come for and folded back into the dark. They belonged to a platoon the rest of the corps called the 40 Thieves. And on Saipan, they did this night after night. 3 weeks later, organized Japanese resistance on Saipan had collapsed, and nearly 30,000 defenders were dead. The cause was not simply numbers. It was not simply firepower. It was an American idea, born 2 years earlier in the mud of Guadalcanal. The idea was this: you do not beat the master of the jungle by meeting his ambush with a heavier charge. You beat him by building a better hunter than he is. For nearly 2 months on Guadalcanal, that had looked impossible. Marine patrols walked out into the green wall of the jungle and did not walk back. The Japanese soldier moved through that vegetation the way a current moves through water, without disturbance, without warning. The American infantryman, trained to advance in a line and close with his enemy, could not see the man 10 feet in front of him who was about to kill him. The ambushes followed a pattern that felt almost deliberate in its cruelty. Japanese marksmen picked off the officer first, the man giving orders, the man holding the map. Machine guns held their fire until an entire squad had walked past, then opened up from behind, into the backs of men who thought the danger lay ahead. A patrol would step into a clearing that looked empty and discover, in the last second of several lives, that it had never been empty at all, and the losses were not occasional. Week after week, patrols went out to map the enemy and came back short, or did not come back at all. The jungle swallowed them in 1s and 2s, and sometimes in whole squads, and the aid stations filled with men who had been hit before they ever saw who hit them. The arithmetic was simple and unforgiving. At the rate the ambushes were killing them, the division would run out of infantry long before the enemy ran out of jungle. Conventional infantry doctrine, the doctrine the Marine Corps had carried into its first battle against the Japanese Army, was worse than useless in that terrain. It got men killed on a schedule. A commander could send out a patrol and know, with something close to certainty, that some of those men were walking into an ambush no amount of courage would let them win. Courage is not much use against an enemy you cannot find. But the story of how that changed does not begin on Saipan in 1944. It begins in the mud of Guadalcanal in the autumn of 1942, with a Marine officer who had just been relieved of his command, an officer who, by every ordinary rule of the service, should have been on a ship home. Guadalcanal was a fight over a single airstrip. The 1st Marine Division, under Major General Alexander Vandergrift, had landed on the 7th of August, 1942, in the opening move of Operation Watchtower. They had taken an unfinished Japanese airfield, renamed it Henderson Field, and everything that followed for 6 months was a struggle to keep it. Whoever held that field held the air over the southern Solomon Islands. The Japanese wanted it back, and they fed men onto the island to take it, and those men were very good at the fighting the jungle allowed. The fight for the island was never only a fight on the ground. It was a struggle in 3 dimensions at once. By night, Japanese warships ran down the passage the Americans called the slot to land fresh troops and shell the airfield, a routine that earned the nickname the Tokyo Express. By day, the Cactus Air Force and the carriers offshore tried to sink those ships and hold the sky. The men in the perimeter lived inside that larger contest, and every soldier the Tokyo Express put ashore was another soldier who might be waiting in the trees when a patrol went out. The airfield lived or died by the ground around it, and the ground was the problem. The Marines holding the perimeter learned quickly that the terrain lied to them. A ridge that looked bare could hide a company. A trail that looked used could be bait. A stretch of jungle that had stood empty at dusk could be full of the enemy by dawn. The Americans had already been given a brutal lesson in how the Japanese fought and how they thought. In late August, a Japanese detachment under Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki threw itself across the Ilu River, east of the perimeter, in a night attack that counted on shock and the bayonet to break the Marine line. The Marines held, and Ichiki's force was almost annihilated against their fire. It told the division two things at once. The enemy would attack with a ferocity that ignored his own losses, and he would rely on darkness and surprise to deliver it. Both lessons pointed the same way. The Marines needed to see him coming. They saw how narrow the margin could be a few weeks later. In the middle of September, on a low rise south of the airfield that the men came to call Edson's Ridge, a Japanese force infiltrated close and attacked in the dark, and it came within a very thin margin of breaking through to Henderson Field itself. The line held, barely. The lesson of the ridge was written in blood and understood at once. An enemy this skilled at moving unseen could bring a large body of troops almost to the wire before anyone knew they were there. After the ridge, patrolling became the perimeter's early warning system, and the perimeter paid for it. The only way to learn what the enemy was gathering was to send men into the trees to look. There had already been costly fights along the Matanikau River, west of the perimeter, including one attempt in late September when a Marine battalion was cut off and had to be pulled out by boat, in an operation the men bitterly nicknamed a Little Dunkirk. Looking at the enemy, in that jungle, killed the men who did the looking faster than the division could afford. Into that problem walked Lieutenant Colonel William John Whailing, an officer the division did not quite know what to do with. Whaling was a Marine of a particular and increasingly rare kind. He had been born in St. Cloud, Minnesota, in 1894, the son of Canadian immigrants. He had enlisted in the Corps in 1917, trained at Paris Island, and earned his commission in the field in the First World War. Above almost everything else, he was a shooter. He had competed for the United States at the Olympic Games of 1924 in the 25-meter rapid-fire pistol, and he understood rifles and ground and stalking the way most officers understood paperwork. That was part of his trouble. Whaling was known throughout the division as a man of legendary field skills and very little patience for administration. He had come ashore on Guadalcanal in August as the executive officer of the 5th Marine Regiment, under Colonel Leroy Hunt. By late September, Vandergrift had decided the 5th Marines needed new leadership, and Colonel Hunt was relieved on the 25th. 4 days later, Whaling was relieved as well. Most officers in that position were sent back to the United States, their combat careers effectively finished. Whaling was not, and the reason was a single man. Colonel Gerald Thomas, now the division chief of staff, knew exactly what Whaling was worth in that specific jungle, and he arranged for him to stay. So Whaling sat in the middle of the very problem his skills were built to solve. An officer without a job and with the finest fieldcraft in the division. So he proposed a solution. He went to the division leadership with an idea for a unit that did not exist anywhere in the Marine Corps table of organization. It would be a scout and sniper detachment, roughly 100 volunteers, chosen for their ability in the field. It would be trained to do the one thing regular patrols could not do, which was to move through the jungle without dying in it. The men would scout. They would gather intelligence. They would kill the enemy's officers and observers before the main body of Marines ever came into contact. It is worth being precise about what the American decision actually was, because it was not the decision to form one small unit. It was a decision about doctrine. The instinctive answer to a punishing ambush is to hit back harder, to push more infantry forward, to overwhelm the position by sheer weight. Whailing proposed the opposite. He proposed to answer stealth with stealth. He proposed to meet the hunter by manufacturing hunters, to take the enemy's own method, infiltration and silence and the patient killing of the man who matters most, and turn it back against him. General Vandergrift approved the idea almost at once, and he did so for a reason rooted in history. Vandergrift was a student of Robert Rogers, the colonial officer who in the 1750s had built small, mobile, independent units to operate far beyond the reach of the main army during the French and Indian War. Rogers had proven that a handful of men who knew the ground could do what a regiment could not. To Vandergrift, with his patrols bleeding out in the trees, the idea did not sound like an experiment. It sounded like the answer. There was something almost heretical in the idea, measured against everything the Marine Corps believed about itself. The Corps was built around the riflemen in the squad, around mass and cohesion and the closing assault, around the old principle that every Marine, whatever his job, was first a rifleman in a line of riflemen. Whaling was proposing to pull the best of those men out of the line and turn them loose in twos and threes, unsupervised, to fight a private war in the dark. It cut against the grain of the whole institution. That it was approved at all is a measure of how badly the jungle was hurting the division, and of how far a desperate commander will reach when the ordinary answers keep getting his men killed. When Whaling gathered his volunteers, he did not sell them a glory. He told them plainly what the work would be. They would operate in tiny teams, sometimes for days, sometimes behind the enemy, with no support and no promise of rescue if it went wrong. The reconnaissance carried a casualty risk that would have emptied a normal unit. He asked for volunteers anyway, and he got them, because there were always men who would rather hunt than be hunted. To understand why the idea worked, you have to understand what the Marines were actually up against, because the Japanese soldier on Guadalcanal was not the caricature that later cartoons made him. In that terrain, he was extraordinarily dangerous. Japanese training prized night movement, concealment, and infiltration. Their soldiers could carry heavy loads across country the Americans considered impassable. And they could do it quietly, and they could appear at the edge of a perimeter that believed itself secure. The men fighting for the island belonged to the Japanese 17th Army under Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, and among them was the Sendai Division, a formation with a hard reputation. The Japanese commanders assumed they knew how the Americans would fight, and for good reason, because for weeks the Americans had fought exactly as expected. They assumed the Marines would advance in the open, along the coast and the trails, in formations a defender could see and range and cut apart. They built their ambushes around that assumption. Almost everything the enemy did in the jungle was designed to punish a soldier who moved the way American infantry had been taught to move. What Whaling set out to build was a Marine who moved the other way. On the 3rd of October, 1942, he took his first volunteers into the jungle west of Henderson Field and gave them one instruction: walk 100 yards without making a sound. Every one of them failed. Canteens knocked against rifles. Boots snapped buried branches. Gear rattled with each step, and in that heavy air the jungle amplified all of it. Any Japanese position within 200 yards would have heard the patrol long before it saw anything. So Whaling stripped them down. He had them tape every piece of metal that could ring, wrap every hook and buckle in cloth, and trade the standard boot for something softer that would not crack the undergrowth. He made them do it again and again. Within a few days, a good share of them could move through the vegetation quietly enough to close on a position that did not know they were there. That was the first skill, and in that jungle it was the whole difference between a hunter and a casualty. The second skill was shooting, and here Whaling had something no manual could give them, which was himself. Most Marines could hit a target at 300 yards on a rifle range. But a range has no wind that shifts, no rain, no humidity thickening the air, and no target that shoots back. Whaling taught his men to read distance from the shape of the ground. He taught them to judge the wind by the way the leaves moved. He drilled them to fire from the ugly, cramped positions that real terrain forced on them, uphill and downhill, and lying in the mud behind cover that barely deserved the name. There was more to the craft than silence and marksmanship. Whaling taught his men to read the ground for sign, the bent grass and the disturbed earth that told them who had passed and how long ago. He taught them camouflage that broke the human outline, and patience, and the discipline to lie still for hours. The rifle that anchored the work was the bolt-action Springfield, the M1903, fitted where possible with a unilateral telescopic sight that turned a good shot into a killing one at long range, and he chose his men for the lives they had lived before the Corps. He wanted hunters and woodsmen, men from farms and back country who had tracked animals and read weather since boyhood, because those instincts could not be taught on a parade ground in a week. The rifle itself carried a whole tradition behind it. The Marine Corps had prized precision shooting since long before the war, sending teams to the national matches and building a culture around the man who could place a single round exactly where he wanted it. The telescopic sight Whaling's snipers used, made by the Unertal Company, had been built for target ranges rather than battlefields, and it magnified the world roughly 8 times over. In a real shooter's hands, it turned the deceptive distances of the jungle into something a man could measure and master. It was competition marksmanship carried onto a killing ground, and very few armies in the world could match the depth of it. The hardest thing to teach was not a physical skill at all. It was a way of thinking. Regular Marine infantry fought in squads with a clear chain of command, where orders came down from an officer and individual initiative was, if anything, discouraged. Whaling needed the reverse. He needed men who could operate in teams of 2 or 3 for days, with no officer nearby. He needed men who could make their own decisions and adapt when the plan fell apart, as the plan always did. He trained them to read terrain and map enemy movement, and to estimate the size of a force from its cooking fires and its noise. That was the kind of judgment regular infantry never developed, because someone else had always done their thinking for them. Before the offensive, Whaling sent his half-trained teams out to prove they could do the thing he had promised. They went in small groups into the country west of the perimeter, found Japanese gun positions and machine gun nests, and mapped the trails the enemy used. They came back with the kind of detailed picture the division had been unable to get in 2 months of ordinary patrolling. One team was nearly caught, spotted at close range, and had to shoot its way clear and run for the lines with the enemy on its heels. But it came back, and it came back with the map. That was the proof. The idea was no longer a theory. The full test came in the first week of October 1942, when Vandergrift launched an offensive along the Matanikau River to drive the Japanese west and put Henderson Field beyond the reach of their artillery. Whaling was given a task force built around the 3rd Battalion of the 2nd Marines and his own scout and sniper detachment. On the maps and in the reports it was called the Whailing Group. Its job was to move inland, cross the river upstream, and roll up the Japanese flank while the main body attacked along the coast. The offensive ran from the 7th to the 9th of October. The Whaling Group crossed upriver and moved through country the Japanese did not expect an American force to move through. It helped close a trap around the Japanese defenders west of the Matanikau. Between the 6th and the 9th of October, roughly 750 men of the Japanese 4th Infantry Regiment were killed in that encirclement, and the regiment was wrecked as a fighting force. There was an irony buried in that battle that the Marines only learned afterward, from documents taken off a dead Japanese officer. The enemy had not been sitting still. The Japanese had been preparing an offensive of their own, aimed at the American perimeter, and the date they had set for it was the 8th of October, the very middle of the American attack. The Marines struck first by a margin of days. The force that had been massing to strike Henderson Field was instead cut to pieces on the ground where it had gathered. The Whaling Group had done what regular patrols could not. It had gathered the intelligence that let the division see the enemy for once. It had guided the main body around the strong points instead of straight into them. It had killed the men whose loss unravelled the Japanese defence. The Marine casualties in that offensive were lighter than in the frontal fights that had come before. The method worked, and it worked in the one currency that mattered on Guadalcanal, which was American lives not spent walking into ambushes. The value of what the scouts brought back was not only in the men they killed, it was in the map of the enemy they built. For the first time, a Marine commander could look at where the Japanese guns and strong points actually were, rather than guessing and sending infantry to find out the hard way. With that knowledge, an attack could be aimed around a strong point instead of into it, and a flank could be turned that would otherwise have been stormed head-on. Intelligence that had cost dozens of lives to gather by ordinary patrol could now be had by a handful of men who came back to tell it. The enemy was not finished after the Matanikau. In late October, the Sendai Division launched the largest Japanese attack of the campaign, a series of massed assaults against the southern face of the perimeter, aimed once more at Henderson Field. It was thrown back with terrible loss to the attackers, and it broke the back of the 17th Army's ability to take the offensive. But it also confirmed the pattern the scout and sniper detachment had been built to counter. The Japanese massed in the jungle where they could not be seen, struck in the dark, and relied on the American inability to know they were there until the assault was already underway. The remedy was the one it had always been. See him first. The proof held up when the method was used again. In early November, along the coast near Point Cruz, the Whaling Group took part in another encirclement that finished off the remnants of the same shattered Japanese regiment. What had begun as one officer's improvisation was now a tool the division reached for on purpose. The campaign that had birthed the idea was itself nearing its end for the men who started it. The fighting on Guadalcanal ground on into the winter, on the land, and in the air, and in the waters around the island, and it cost the 1st Marine Division dearly. By the time the division was relieved and pulled out for rest in Australia in December of 1942, it had suffered close to 3,000 casualties. The men who had walked ashore in August left the island exhausted, gaunt and sick with malaria. But they left behind a working answer to the jungle, and the answer stayed in the core after they had gone. Whaling himself did not see the campaign through. He was wounded, an infection set in, and he was evacuated to recover, missing the rest of the fight for the island. But the idea he had built from nothing did not leave with him. The division took what he had proven and made it permanent. By early 1943, the 1st Marine Division had formalized scout and sniper platoons, standardized the training and the selection, and written into doctrine the thing Whaling had invented in the mud. He was later awarded the Legion of Merit. The citation said in plain words what he had done. He had organized a scout and sniper detachment and trained it in scouting, stalking, and ambush, and his knowledge of jungle warfare had contributed immeasurably to the success of the division's patrols. That is the part of the story the histories tend to leave out. The unit that became America's answer to the Japanese jungle master was built by an officer the Corps had just relieved of command, a man who by the ordinary rules should have been on a boat home. It took 7 hours to get every name and number in this story right, because the doctrine that saved so many marine lives in the Pacific was not handed down from a school or a manual. It was invented on the spot by a man the service had, for one moment, decided it did not need. If this is the history you want more of, hit like. 1 like. Nothing more. Thank you. The men lying in the sugarcane outside Garapan in 1944 were the heirs of that idea. But they were not gentle outdoorsmen, and their commander had chosen them for the exact opposite of what Whaling had wanted. To understand how the doctrine reached its most extreme form, you have to go to the island of Hawaii in the early weeks of 1944, and to a lieutenant walking into a brig looking for the worst men he could find. The Battle of Tarawa in November of 1943 had been a slaughter. It was the first time in the Pacific that the United States had assaulted a beach the Japanese had fortified and were ready to defend. Some 4,500 Japanese defenders had fought almost to the last man, and the Marines had learned in 3 days how much such a thing could cost. Out of that lesson came a decision inside the 6th Marine Regiment. The regiment's commander, Colonel James Risley, ordered the formation of an elite scout and sniper platoon. It would be modelled this time not only on Whaling's jungle detachment, but on the British commandos, and Risley kept it under his own personal control. He handed the job of building it to First Lieutenant Frank Tuchowski. The 6th Marines were not a green regiment thrown together for the occasion. They were among the most travelled and seasoned Marines in the whole Pacific. The regiment had sailed for Iceland in the summer of 1941, months before Pearl Harbor, to relieve British troops holding the island against a possible German move, which made its men some of the first Americans sent into harm's way in the entire war. By the time they reached the training camps on Hawaii, they had already crossed 2 oceans and bled at Tarawa. The core of the new platoon would be drawn from exactly that hardened stock. Tuchowski was 29 years old, from New Brighton, Pennsylvania, a veteran of Guadalcanal and Tarawa. He had a theory about the kind of man he wanted that scandalized the officers around him. He did not want disciplined, obedient Marines. He had read what the reconnaissance teams had done in the jungle, and he understood something about the work. A man alone behind the enemy for days needed a quality the Corps spent most of its time training out of its men. He needed the willingness to think for himself and the refusal to quit when the situation turned bad. So Tuchowski went looking for troublemakers. His logic was blunt and, in its way, unanswerable. When 2 Marines fight, one wins and one loses. The loser goes to the infirmary. The winner, charged with assault, goes to the brig. The military justice system, he pointed out, punishes the man who proved he could win. That winner, the man with a record of brawling and a stretch in the brig, was exactly the man Tuchowski wanted. He had already shown that he would not go down and would not give up when violence came for him. Hit subscribe right now, because coming up is the day these men landed on Saipan. And what they did in the 3 weeks that followed made them a legend in the Corps and a nightmare for the Japanese army. Do not go anywhere. The brig commanders thought Tucholsky was insane. He was asking for the most undisciplined men on the base, the fighters and the insubordinate and the ones who wrecked property. The men most units were desperate to be rid of. Tucholsky told them that was precisely the point. He interviewed Marines with discipline records and asked them why they fought, what they had done before the war, and whether they could kill a man in silence. He filled out his platoon with them, and he added sharpshooters who had already proven themselves at Tarawa to give the unit its long-range teeth. His platoon sergeant was Bill Knoppel, who had served alongside him since the regiment's Iceland days. The nickname came from the men themselves, and from what they did to survive. The Marine Corps in that war was the poorest equipped of the services. Its men had gone into Guadalcanal with leftover gear from the First World War, and they had learned to make up for what the supply system failed to give them through what they politely called marine methods. Marine methods meant stealing. Tucholsky's platoon raised the craft to an art. They raided Army and Navy depots for better weapons, better food, and better everything. And the envious regiments around them started calling them the 40 Thieves. It was not entirely an insult. It was a kind of respect for men who took what they needed and answered to almost no one. The stories of what they lifted became legend in their own right. They took weapons and rations and cases of whiskey. They acquired a jeep and repainted it in marine colours so no one could prove whose it had been. By some accounts they made off with livestock, and by one telling they even absorbed a pair of army privates who simply shipped out to the war alongside them. The point was never mischief for its own sake. It was a hard, practical logic learned by the poorest equipped service in the war. If the supply system would not give a man what he needed to live and fight, he found it himself, and he did not apologize. The platoon trained in the highlands of the island of Hawaii, building on Whaling's foundation and then going past it. They drilled the silent movement, the long-range shooting, the map reading. Then they added the things a commando needed and a sniper did not. They learned knife fighting and the garrote. They learned to kill a sentry without a sound and to live off the land where no resupply could reach them. Among the men Tucholsky gathered was Corporal Bob Smots, who had grown up on the Osage Nation reservation in Oklahoma, where he had learned to hunt, trap, and shoot before the Corps ever taught him. Another was Marvin Strombo, whose war would follow him home in ways none of them could yet imagine. The place they trained was a stretch of ranch country in the highlands of the island, a raw camp among the cattle pastures and the volcanic slopes. It was hard ground, and the training was harder. Almost every man in the platoon was already a veteran, blooded on Guadalcanal or Tarawa or both, and they had no illusions left about what waited for them. They drilled until the silent movement, and the knife work and the shooting were not skills they performed, but things they simply were. When they were not training, they were, true to their name, improving their equipment at the expense of whoever had parked it unguarded. At the end of May, 1944, the 6th Marines and their scout and sniper platoon boarded the transport USS Bolivar and sailed west. On the deck of that ship, days into the voyage, the men listened over the loudspeakers as President Roosevelt asked the American people to pray for the troops going ashore that morning in Normandy. They were sailing toward their own landing, and at least one of the thieves is remembered muttering that no amount of praying was going to save him where he was going. Somewhere along the way, the men learned where that was. Their next fight would be Saipan. Saipan was an island in the Mariana chain, some 45 square miles of volcanic rock and cane and jungle, and it mattered far more than its size suggested. It was part of what Japan considered its inner empire. territory the enemy regarded as its own and would defend to the last man. Take it, and the United States would have airfields from which the new B-29 bombers could reach the home islands of Japan themselves. That is why the assault was so large. It is also why, far out at sea while the Marines fought ashore, the American and Japanese fleets collided in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. That carrier fight gutted what remained of Japanese naval air power and sealed the garrison's fate. No relief was coming. The men defending Saipan were, from the second week of the battle, fighting a siege they could not win. The assault carried a name, Operation Forager, and a purpose larger than the island itself. The Marianas sat astride the road to Japan, and airfields there would bring American heavy bombers within reach of Japanese cities for the first time in the war. The Japanese understood the stakes as clearly as the Americans did, which is why they had packed the island with troops and prepared to make the invaders pay for every yard. For the men in the landing craft at dawn, none of that grand strategy mattered. What mattered was the beach ahead, the fire coming off it, and whether they would clear the water alive. The landings came at dawn on the 15th of June, 1944. 2 Marine divisions went in against a defender who had zeroed his artillery on the beaches long before the first American arrived. Japanese shells and mortars and machine guns fell on the landing zones with a precision that killed men before they cleared the water. The first waves took terrible losses. Into that, in the following waves, came the 40 thieves, and their war was different from the moment they crossed the sand. While the assault companies fought for the beach, Tucholsky's platoon pushed inland toward the things regular Marines would not reach for days. They went after command posts, artillery positions, supply dumps, and above all, the enemy officers whose loss would blind and confuse the men they led. The ground favored the hunters. The cane fields dropped visibility to a few feet. The Japanese held caves and bunkers and camouflaged holes across the island, and a man who could move silently through that country could get close to almost anything. They began to do the work they had trained for. A 2-man team would find a radio operator setting up alone, close on him from behind, and leave him dead in the cane. They took his codes and maps and hid his body, and the officers who depended on him would not know for hours that they had gone deaf. Another team would take out a forward observation post with knives, and the artillery that observer had been directing would fall silent or fall blind. Marines somewhere else on the island would then advance through a gap that had opened for reasons the enemy could not see. Tucholsky led from the front, and one moment above the others defined him. A Japanese tank broke toward the 6th Marines' lines and the regimental command post, the kind of thrust that could unravel a position and kill the men directing the whole regiment's fight. Tucholsky took up a bazooka, a weapon his platoon had acquired by its usual methods, and moved through heavy machine gun fire to get an angle on it. He destroyed the tank. It was exactly the kind of thing the Corps' own discipline system would never have predicted from a platoon of brig veterans. It was also exactly what Tucholsky had built the platoon to do, and it stood among the actions that made him a decorated man. The fighting on Saipan did not stay clean, and it did not stay survivable for long. As the thieves and units like them cut into the Japanese rear, the enemy commanders realized that American reconnaissance was working behind their lines, and they answered with a savagery that changed the character of the battle. Patrols were tightened, ambushes were laid for the men laying ambushes. In at least one case recorded by the platoon's own survivors, the Japanese used wounded Marines as bait, leaving them in the open to draw a rescue and springing the trap when others came for them. The losses were not statistics to the men who took them. One of the platoon, a young Marine the others knew as Kenny, was killed in front of them in the elephant grass. close enough that they could do nothing but watch. Decades later, one of the survivors still described the same dream returning night after night, the sight of Kenny falling and the helpless run through the grass that followed. These were not men who spoke easily about what they had seen. Most of them spent the rest of their lives trying not to. That was the private cost behind the legend, and it never appeared in the citations. That kind of war grinds a small unit down fast. The platoon fought for days without relief or rotation, half of it scouting by day and half of it slipping into the enemy's positions by night. The men slept in snatches and ate what they could carry or steal or find. They took losses they could not replace. Men were killed. Men were carried off wounded. A platoon that had landed at full strength was, within a couple of weeks, a shrinking group of exhausted men doing the most dangerous work on the island, with fewer hands to do it each day. Their reconnaissance mattered in ways that showed up in other units' advances. When a team located a Japanese command position dug into a cave and found it too strong to storm, they marked it and called down naval gunfire. The heavy shells did what a rifle could not, and an enemy headquarters vanished, and the Marines nearby moved forward against a foe who had suddenly lost his coordination. The pattern repeated across the campaign. The thieves found the thing that mattered, and either killed it themselves in silence or brought the weight of the fleet down on it. Much of that work centered on Mount Tapachau, the volcanic peak at the heart of the island. Whoever held its heights could see the movement below and call fire onto it, and the fighting to take and hold that ground was some of the hardest on Saipan. The scout and sniper teams worked its slopes and trails, finding the observers and the guns that were killing Marines elsewhere and marking them for destruction. There was a psychological weight to what the platoon did that went past the men it killed. An army that cannot trust its own rear does not fight the same way. When officers begin to die in the dark far behind the line, when radio operators go silent for no reason, when a command post is found and destroyed by fire that seems to come from nowhere, the effect spreads outward as caution and doubt. The Japanese had come to think of infiltration as their own weapon. Now it was being used against them, on their own ground, and they could feel it. In the days before the final Japanese attack, the scout and sniper teams did some of their most dangerous work, slipping into the enemy's assembly areas to find and kill officers and sow confusion where the Japanese were massing. It was murderous work with no margin for error, deep in ground, thick with enemy troops, and the men who did it were fortunate to come back at all. It helped disorder an enemy who was already coming apart. What it did not do, and what honest history will not claim, is win the battle by itself. The battle was won by the whole weight of 2 Marine divisions and the guns of the fleet, and the small teams were one sharp edge of a very large blade. The battle for Saipan came to its climax in the early hours of the 7th of July, 1944, in one of the largest banzai charges of the entire Pacific War. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, by most estimates somewhere between 3,000 and more than 4,000, threw themselves at the American lines in a final mass attack. Many carried little more than bayonets and the willingness to die. The fighting was hand-to-hand and close and horrifying, and the Americans in the path of it fought with rifles and pistols and knives and anything that would kill. The charge failed. It broke against American firepower and left thousands of Japanese dead in front of the lines, and with it, organized resistance on Saipan effectively ended. It is tempting, and some tellings of this story give in to the temptation, to say that the scout and sniper platoons won that fight in advance by killing the officers who should have led it. The truth is more measured and, in a way, more useful. The banzai charge was poorly coordinated and doomed for many reasons. Chief among them, the exhaustion and desperation of a garrison that was already beaten, and the wall of American fire it ran into. The reconnaissance units added to the chaos in the enemy's rear. They did not by themselves cause the collapse, and a channel that wants to be trusted should say so plainly. What is beyond dispute is what the platoon paid and what it proved. Here is how the campaign ran in order. June 15th, 1944. The Marines land on Saipan against Japanese artillery, zeroed on the beaches in advance. June 16th and 17th. The scout and sniper platoon pushes into the Japanese rear, working the approaches to Mount Tapochau and Garapan, killing in silence. Middle of June onward. Tchaikovsky destroys a Japanese tank threatening the regimental command post. The enemy begins using wounded Marines as bait against reconnaissance teams. Late June. Worn down by continuous fighting and mounting losses, the platoon keeps up its work by day and night as the Japanese prepare a final attack. July 7th, 1944. Thousands of Japanese launch a mass banzai charge. It breaks against American fire, and organized resistance on Saipan collapses. The factors that made the difference are worth naming, because together they are the real lesson of the two campaigns. The first factor was the decision itself. It was the choice to answer the jungle master by building hunters, rather than by pushing more infantry into his ambushes. That was Whaling's contribution, and everything the 40 thieves did on Saipan descended from it. The second factor was the men. Whaling had recruited outdoorsmen and marksmen. Tchaikovsky recruited the men the Corps had locked up. Both bet that the qualities the service most distrusted, independence and stubbornness, and the refusal to fold, were exactly the qualities that kept a man alive and useful alone behind the enemy. Both were proven right. The third factor was the method, which was the enemy's own. The Japanese soldiers' mastery of infiltration and silence, and the killing of the man who mattered, was turned back on him by Americans who had learned to do it as well or better, on his ground, at night, without a sound. The fourth factor was independence. The whole value of these units lay in their ability to operate without orders, to see and decide and act in places no chain of command could reach, and to do it for days at a time. It was the one thing regular doctrine could not manufacture, and it was the thing that made the difference. Strip away the maps and the casualty counts, and this story comes down to a single reversal worth stating plainly. The acknowledged master of the jungle was beaten at his own game, on his own ground, by hunters America built. And it built them out of the very men its own machine had thrown away. The officer it had relieved of command wrote the doctrine. The men it had locked in the brig carried it to its deadliest form. The trait the service punished, the refusal to quit, and the willingness to think alone, was the trait that won. What became of them is its own quiet irony. William Whaling, the unassigned officer sitting in the mud with no job, recovered from his wounds and went on to command the 1st Marines at Cape Gloucester and the 29th Marines on Okinawa, where he earned the Navy Cross for gallantry. He rose to general and served on into the Korean War before he retired, and he lived until 1989. Frank Tchaikovsky, who had gone looking for the worst men on the base, wore his decorations for the rest of his life, and later became the mayor of Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin. His own son did not learn the full story of the 40 thieves until after his father was dead, and had to reconstruct it from a footlocker in the garage and the memories of the old men who had served under him. For decades the story stayed almost entirely buried. Tchaikovsky, like most of the men, did not talk about it. It was only long after his death that his son, working from that footlocker of papers and the fading recollections of the last surviving thieves, pieced the platoon's war back together, and finally put it on the record. Much of what can be said with any confidence about the 40 thieves survives for one reason. A son refused to let his father's silence be the final word. After Saipan, there was almost no pause. The same divisions crossed to the neighbouring island of Tinian and took it as well, and the survivors of the platoon went with them. The Tinian landing was executed so cleanly that officers later studied it as a model of how an amphibious assault ought to be run. The scout and sniper platoon did not outlast the war as a standing unit. The men were eventually scattered back to the regiments and the reconnaissance sections, carrying what they knew with them. But the knowledge did not scatter. It had already been written into how the Marine Corps thought about reconnaissance and precision killing, and that was the thing that endured. The lineage that Whailing and Tchaikovsky began in 1942 ran on from there. It carried through Korea and Vietnam and every war after, in the reconnaissance platoons and the sniper schools, and the doctrine that treated small independent teams as a weapon in their own right. The Marine Corps finally deactivated the scout-sniper specialty in 2023, 81 years after Whailing first told 100 volunteers to walk 100 yards in silence. The men the Corps discarded had founded something that outlived almost everyone who built it. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because every week we show you how America actually won the war it is remembered for. Not the version that skips the fired officer, the platoon of brig veterans, and the fact that the doctrine was invented in the mud rather than handed down from a school. Hit subscribe, then like. So this reaches more people who should understand how the Jungle Master was finally beaten at his own game. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We will see you in the next one.